So I'll be talking about the positive list. I'm Dutch. When I went to school in the Netherlands, the positive list was something we debated in school, and therefore I've been starting following it. Since I came to Canada, I kept my network in Europe, and through that way we're trying now to implement the positive list in Canada and the municipalities. So what I'm going to talk about first is why we want to regulate exotic pets, and why we want to regulate exotic pets more rigorously than probably our domesticated animals. And we already heard a lot about this today, so I'm not going to bore you to death with the details. First of all, animal welfare. Exotic pets, as we now know, and I think we already kind of knew, is that they have complex needs. Often we don't quite understand what their needs are to give them fulfilling lives in captivity. Needs, as I said, are poorly understood and often difficult to meet. And not only because we don't know them, but exotic pets often need more space, particular diets that cost a lot of money, special vet care, which costs extra money, and therefore a lot of, if you have, you live in Toronto, you pay a lot of rent, an exotic pet might just add up to that bill that you can't really afford. Consumer and community safety. So this picture was taken in Toronto, I think it was August 15th. The snake escaped its enclosure and ended up 2 floors above its house, its home. And the people that lived in that apartment, I think it was the husband who grabbed the snake because he thought his phone dropped on the ground and grabbed the snake instead. And the snake slithered off into a wall. They had to bring in some people to open the wall to take the snake out. And I didn't know the snake got rehomed or taken away. But it's a nuisance. It's not nice for somebody to wake up in the middle of the night and find a very big snake under their bed. It costs money. You need to bring in people who can fix this and who can open up the wall and close it hopefully afterwards. So economics, or the economy, that's something that plays. Consumer safety. I mean, exotic pets can do quite a bit of harm. And if we don't protect our consumers from that, as Clifford showed with like the stuffed animal and the turtle, we have to consider those things. And then protecting our local and global environments. And personally, I'm very much convinced that if we want to protect our local animals, we're not allowed to keep native wildlife. Why would we be any different if we look across our borders and be like, hey, we'll just take their native wildlife because that's okay somehow? To me, that doesn't make sense. So regulating exotic pets doesn't only mean that you probably going to limit risk of invasiveness or introduction of novel diseases, but also you'll be helping other countries to protect their environments. And I think that's our duty as a global community. All right, so I'm going to skip through that. So here in Toronto, now we know why we need to regulate. We can look at the regulation currently in place. And this is the Toronto Bylaw. And as you can see, there are 16 mammal species, 6 bird species or orders, crocodilia, all venomous and poisonous animals, which makes sense. And then snakes over 3 meters and lizards larger than 2 meters. And I always kind of laugh about that one, and I'll tell you later why. So this is currently in place in Toronto. So this type of legislation, as Leslie already mentioned, is a negative list. So it lets us know which animals we're not allowed to have. There are issues with that, and I'll go through them quickly. Animal welfare implications. So negative lists historically were based on the needs of humans and to protect humans from the danger of animals. So it makes sense that the first negative list was mostly focused on big mammals because they can obviously harm us severely. And that's why we left out birds and fish and reptiles, because we don't consider them necessarily as a risk for us. And the needs of the animals are not considered. So with the Toronto Bylaw, for example, the result is, because reptiles and fish and birds aren't considered, that you get this astronomical amount of animals that are legally, and people are able to keep them as pets. Now, I put some numbers on this next slide. So at the moment, we know that in the wild, there are about 3,709 species of snakes. And every year, new species are discovered. And that's for lizards and frogs, or lizards and amphibians and fish. We haven't discovered them all, I guess. So if you look at the bylaw, you deduct the venomous ones, and the ones that are larger, potentially grow larger than 3 meters when they reach adulthood. It means that technically we're allowed to keep over 3,000 species as snakes. Yeah. And the same with lizards. Like I did the same kind of simple calculations where we can keep over 6,000 species of lizards and over 10,000 species of birds. And that's an insane amount. And the way the negative list is set up, we can't even start to list all those animals. If you look for our domesticated animals, dog species, for example, we only have 340 breeds. And we know all the requirements, and we know what they need to, live healthy and happy lives. No way that we can figure that out for all the 3,000 species of snakes. All right, other concerns. As mentioned before, it doesn't address the habitat threats. And a long list, as you could see with the 3,000 species I mentioned. And what I've noticed in my research is that I feel like municipalities are struggling to correctly use taxonomy terms. So sometimes families and orders get mixed up. It's very confusing. And also in science, sometimes animals are classified differently after a certain amount of years. And this regulation is not set up to adapt to that. All right, so enforcement feasibility, and Leslie talked about this as well. Burden of proof is on the municipality. I use it means it costs a lot of money. And it means substantial problems needs to arise or materialize before measures are taken. And honestly, like what happened in New Brunswick, we shouldn't be waiting around for a terrible accident like that to happen in order to do something. Okay, so what are the alternatives? A complete ban with or without grandfathering of animals. Probably not realistic. There are, the pet trade is huge. There's a lot of financial, the stakes are financial stakes are there as well. And this way, we can do a ban with or without grandfathering, because I think somebody asked, like, what are we going to do with all the animals that we have? Grandfathering is an option, but as we said before, people usually don't really want to register their animal, and there's no way to check it. So even if there's a grandfathering clause within the law, yeah, it's doubtful that people will actually do something with that. Another option, acceptable husbandry standards. I think I can keep that very short. No way we can do that for all the exotic species out there, especially because for half of them, we don't even know what the requirements are, or even more than half of them. And as this morning we discussed, for reptiles and birds, it's probably pretty questionable if any husbandry standards are actually acceptable at all. So third one, and that's what I'm going to go into, is the positive list. So the positive list regulates the animals people can keep. And with people, I mean the general public. I'm not looking at zoos. I'm not looking at like special collectors, though they will be, there are permit requirements or exemptions that are possible, rather not, but that's always a possibility, and that's for the municipality to decide. So this is about so for the positive list as it is, we look at the knowledge of the general public. It's an evidence-based approach, meaning we rely on science, and has to be overwhelming, independent, impartial, scientific, peer-reviewed science. So not what your local pet shop probably will tell you. It needs to be like it published in one of the scientific papers and scientific magazines. So it's vetted information. At the moment, we don't have that. We don't have vetted information. Based on established criteria, I will go over that in a bit. And it's based on the precautionary principle. And this is one of my favorite parts of it. It means that if there's any doubt, any knowledge gaps, any conflict in scientific information, the benefit of the doubt goes to the animal. So if we're in doubt, it means the animal will not end up on the list, and we won't be able to keep the animal. I think that's a great approach. All right, so the criteria. In general, like the positive list will be different for different countries, because what we consider as exotic animals aren't necessarily exotic animals in, Australia. Or the law, for example, say we don't import exotic animals, but you can keep native wildlife. So positive list will adapt according to the region or municipality or the province you're in. But technically, the criteria used, they shouldn't really change. They apply to all of them. So the first of all is animal welfare. And for animal welfare, you can even split that up in different criteria. So normal behavior, diet, space requirements, dietary requirements, what kind of enrichment does it need? Social needs, reproduction needs, all that stuff. So this one, honestly, talking about this piece of legislation, this is the big one, and this is the part most discussions and debates will refer to. Like, who's going to decide, right? And there's where scientific literature comes in. Potential to inflict physical harm, straightforward. Risk of zoonosis, Clifford talked about that a lot. So you have to protect yourself and consumers and other people from getting sick. Risk of invasiveness and or novel diseases. And this one is very important, looking at the bird and reptile industry. If the animal wants to be on the positive list, it needs to be from a self-sustaining captive population. Because if nothing like that exists, it means that the illegal wild-caught will continue, right? And again, if it means that you have to keep importing wild animals to keep the pet industry alive, or that sort of animal in captivity, just don't have it. Last one, which is, I think, very regional specific, is having the ability to rehome unwanted animals. So if you are in a small community, you have one rescue center with set up for cats and dogs or maybe rabbits, maybe that's all that municipality should have on their list. Because again, there is a limit on the financial means, on space, and people who know about these animals. So again, for everybody, you have to consider, are you able to take care of pets that aren't wanted anymore in the home of people? Right, so the implementation process. Before I go further, I would like to say something about, like, the pet industry is not a fan of the positive list. You might have figured that out. They claim it's too cumbersome, it's too much work, it's too much. Maybe initially, to do all the legislative or all the scientific work, it takes some time, but luckily there are already examples out there, countries that already have done it. So we can share information, which I think is very, very important. And these criteria are very comprehensive. So this will mean that not many animals will meet all the criteria in order to end up on the list. So the list itself is very manageable. So, and if you only have like, oh, well, we don't want invasive animals and we need public safety to consider, that means that the list will be much longer because a lot more animals will meet those criteria. So the right way to go is be very critical, set the criteria, set the bar high, and then animals will have to meet that. And once those criteria are in place, it's pretty easy from there. It might require a little bit of work at the beginning. So the implementation process. First of all, you need to figure out which government entity is responsible for adjusting your legislation. Assuming you all know that, the next question is which list to implement. Ideally, we eventually end up with lists from reptiles, mammals, fish, birds, everything. However, you want to start with mammals. Several reasons. There aren't as many mammal species out there compared to your birds and your reptiles. People are more familiar with mammals. I think people are more susceptible to the idea like you should not have a monkey as a pet or not a lion. So there's a public platform that accepts that idea. So you should end up with less resistance than you would probably have with birds and fish and reptiles. Next step is to analyze exotic pets in your community. So there are like 5,000 species of mammals. You don't have to analyze them all 5,000. What you want to do is you want to go into your community, talk to pet shop owners, breeders, anybody who's involved in the mammal exotic pet industry, and see which mammals are actually being kept, or birds or whatever, in your community. And those are the animals you want to analyze. Any animal that's not in your community doesn't end up on the list automatically. Then usually this goes through the municipality or the government, the establishment of an animal welfare review panel who are responsible to collect all the data and present it to the council. The subcommittees, because it's a lot of work, right, to analyze all these animals. The subcommittees are responsible to review the animals based on the criteria that were set. A couple of things that I need to mention is that the review panel as well as the subcommittees, you want all stakeholders involved. I know that having people from the pet industry probably is going to end up in a lot of discussions, but you'd rather have them involved at the start than have them challenge you afterwards once everything is ready to be implemented. For the subcommittee, it's very important that you get some experts. So for example, if you're debating big cats, make sure you have some sort of cat expert that knows about behavior requirements, etc. And that person can be very helpful in informing people what they should know about the requirements of the animals. And then once everything is said and done, the animal review panel will remain. But they will be responsible for any requests to take animals off the list or add animals to the list. The good thing is that anybody who wants to change the initial list, it's their responsibility to come up with evidence that the list should be changed. So the only thing the review panel needs to do is is there indeed sufficient peer-reviewed scientific evidence for the list to change. All right, so the effects. And I think it's kind of fun. It's kind of the reverse exactly that when I first talked about why we should rigorously regulate animals, exotic animals. You get the opposite effect with the positive list, whereas the negative list, doesn't guarantee consumer safety. The positive list does, because the animals are vetted, they're safe to be used. Same with the community. What they told me in Belgium, for example, is that with the positive list, the list is so short, it's very easy for people to determine if an animal is actually legal or illegal because they know what's on the list. So even the community can help enforcement easier. If they see an animal that doesn't belong on the list in somebody's garden or in somebody's home, they can point it out easier. For the animals, it's quite simple. They're vetted to be, they're okay to be living in captivity. They're okay to, cope with the environment that we provide them, and they can live fulfilling lives. The environment is protected because even if an animal escapes, it's probably not able to remain in the wild. It's not able to transfer any diseases. And for enforcement, for enforcement it's easier because I think there's a shorter list so you can actually train enforcement officers of the animals they should recognize because they're legal. And anything you don't recognize, you can be pretty certain that they're illegal. But the same thing, like the evidence, whenever you want to change the list, again, it's up to the pet industry and not with municipalities and such. All right, so I'm going to go into some examples that I want to talk about. The first country, as far as I know, that's federally introduced a positive list is Belgium. And they were inspired by the Dutch not unless principle. So in the Netherlands, there are a lot of regulations that are based on you can't do something unless. So if something is forbidden until. You see here the criteria, which I already went over to. The one thing I want to point out is the easy to keep criteria in Belgium. So that would be the animal welfare criteria. They literally said an animal should be easy to keep. And I'm like, great, what does that mean? And they're like, well, if you go on holiday and you're going to give your pet to your neighbor, he or she should be able to take care of it no matter what. So you should be able to transport the animal. You should be able to transport the animal to the vet. If it's too big to be transported to the vet, probably not suitable to be kept as pet. They said another easy to keep is like how much space does a pet or an animal need? Like an average house in a city in Belgium is like X. The animal needs 2-3 meters of space for their cage or enclosure. It's not going to fit. It's going to take over most of the apartments, not logical, so we're not going to put the animal on the list. Of course, they did review some literature, and it's not all based on common sense, but the attitude of the Belgian government was very interesting, in my opinion. So this was the review committee. As you can see, all the stakeholders are there, from animal protection groups to hobbyists to people in the pet industry, zoo representatives, etc. All right, and then sequence of events. So in 1995, the Belgian government accepted the principle of the positive list. And that meant that their position was that keeping animals is acceptable in a limited number of cases. They acknowledge that animal welfare is of interest of the public, and that legislation should be proportionate, meaning no prohibition, and it should be based on non-discriminatory criteria. And in their view, the positive list was the best way to go forward. There was no other way to have the same restriction, to have the same measures, achieve the same measures in a different way. Took till 2001, actually, till they turn in the principle of the positive list into the positive list. A lot depended on like which government was in place, how much attention they want, how much pull and push there was. So in 2001, they came out with a list of 42 species. Of course, the pet industry decided they didn't agree on certain things, and they tried to use the argument that because within Europe there are no technically any boundaries, it's free trade, it would affect the free trade, and therefore it's unfair trading. So the European Court listened to their arguments and said, well, Belgium can implement a positive list on 3 criteria. And these criteria are important, I think, also for here, because we might face the same claims that the pet industry will make. So first criteria, the list must be based on objective criteria and cannot discriminate. There must be an easy, approachable procedure for stakeholders who want to add animals to the list. And the third criteria is that the government can only deny an application if the animal poses a real threat to the protection of other animals, people, or the environment. And any denying application must be justified and must be communicated. So the Belgian government was like, okay, we can do that. And in 2016, the list was implemented on a federal basis. The only criticism I personally have with this list is that there are 0 minimum husbandry standards for the 42 animals that are out there. So for me, the ideal situation is you have a positive list, but because the list is pretty short and you know the requirements of the animals because you went through that analysis when you did the criteria, you could create minimum husbandry or acceptable husbandry standards. I think that should be together. They didn't do it, however, and they're pretty happy about how things are going. The main result is that animals that are illegal are off the street. You don't see them in advertisements, you don't see them on TV, you don't see them in pet shops. Now, they're working on the reptile positive list, which is a much bigger challenge because the Belgian government was the first. The mammal keepers group wasn't really prepared for this legislation, and they weren't as well organized. With the reptile people, it's different. They're, at least in Belgium, very well organized, and they have quite strong lobby. And they're very, very, very dedicated, maybe even more than the mammal keepers. So the only change they made in the process of implementing the reptile positive list is that they added this criteria. It must be captive bred. And we already went over the why before. I asked them, well, if anything, what tip would you give us when you implement, if we're looking to implement a positive list here in Canada? And they say, be pragmatic. So their whole idea was, we want this list, and we're not going to fight over every single animal. And you can debate that vision. But they're like, we want to set a tone, and we think, we're not going to knock on everybody's door to see what animal they have behind, like what animal they keep. We believe that the majority of people, once we have this piece of legislation, will adhere to it. So they have some animals on the list I'm not really a fan of, but on the other hand, they're just happy that the positive list is implemented and that people seem to adhere to it as far as they can tell. So they also had a little critique on the Dutch way of doing things, and I'll go over that now. So case study 2 is the Netherlands. In 2014, 280 mammals were identified as being privately owned within the Netherlands. And identifying those animals. For example, the government went to one of the biggest sanctuaries and asked, like, hey, what kind of animals do you get on a regular basis? How many? What do you can you identify which animals are a problem? So they did, and then in 2015, the positive list was implemented. And here they did have some, idea was to have some husbandry requirements. So of all the animals they analyzed, 51 were considered to be suitable pets and didn't need any husbandry standards. And 48 animals, they said they are suitable, but it would be good if people know what they're getting themselves into and setting some acceptable standards. There was a revision coming up in 2016, and the University of Wageningen was responsible of doing this huge assessment of all the animals. And they did it in a way to categorize the risk of how easy, how can I explain it? I would say the effective state of, what would be the risk to affect the mental state and the welfare state of an animal. So the risk assessment looked like this. So this is the fennec fox. One of the criteria, one of the many criteria, was living space, but you also had reproduction, diet, natural environment, etc. So the risk they identified in this case is that a fennec fox needs to dig. What will happen if it can't? As you can see, 28% will display stereotype behaviors. So, and that is considered as being a high risk, the 28%. But they said, how easy would it be to supply that need to the animal? They said, well, that's pretty easy to do. So that's a low risk right there. So the only thing you need is 20 centimeters of substrate they can dig in. That would be sufficient. And they did this for all the animals. So like a huge database of scientific information, because all this was based on science. And their idea was like, once we have this information, the list is implemented, we're going to put this online, eventually translate it to English, and then people can use it. They can see where the scientific data comes from, they can read it for themselves, or they can use it to implement their own lists, or do whatever with it. However, and this is where there's a big difference between the approach of the Dutch and the Belgium. Pet industry didn't agree with it, went to court. And the judge kind of sided with them, and the judge mentioned that the positive list expert committee, so the review panel, consisted of stakeholders that weren't impartial enough, which kind of makes sense because stakeholders have a stake in the whole, they have a stake in it. That's why they're called stakeholders. And I was informed just lately that it wasn't only that, it was like, the issue was it was unlikely to replicate the results that the Dutch review panel came with. So if you would ask 10 other experts to come up with the same analysis of all the animals, you will find different results. And that's why the judge was like, the court was like, we can't proceed with this because it's not impartial enough. It's not transparent enough. So we need to do this over. What's going to happen next? I'm not sure. The people in the Netherlands aren't sure because it's kind of on a standstill now. They need to find experts that don't have a stake in it, that can kind of come up with a method that would be where you could replicate the results. So this is what the Belgian people said. The issue with the Dutch system is that there's too much focus on scientific nature of things. It's very time intensive, and science can be challenged. For them, the essence of the positive list was to get into law and had the priority over fighting over every individual animal. So neither is wrong or right. You both run into issues with probably the pet industry, but it's a way to think about if you want to implement it, what's your end goal? How do you want to, do you want practical? You just want the positive list, or do you really want to, fight over every single animal? Hopefully, the Dutch will eventually figure out their stuff. And then all that scientific information will be released online. I know it will be in Dutch. I can translate. But yeah, so it will become available, and that's something I think municipalities need to keep in mind. There are positive list systems out there in Australia, in Norway, Belgium, Malta, Luxembourg. There are lists out there, and there's information out there. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel again. Use people that know about it. And I think that's it. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Can you speak to how strong the punishment was for breaking these regulatory laws? And I guess, has anybody been successfully charged?
I don't know. I can look that up for you, though. I'm happy to give your contact details, and I'll send you the information. What I do know is that people will get a grace period to give either register or give their exotic animals to authority. And besides that, I'm not sure. I think there were 1 or 2 confiscations, but I'm not sure what kind of penalties were tied to that. Yeah.
So who enforces this? So the police that would be responsible for doing that?
So in Belgium, they actually have an animal welfare department within the government. As the Flemish, the Dutch-speaking part as well as the French-speaking part. So it's the police. And the same in the Netherlands. I think even the Netherlands is setting up their own animal police force. So they are only focused on dealing with animal-related problems. Yeah.
Do you know how many people would be involved with that? Because like in Ontario,
Yeah.
it's like something like 9 conservation officers to cover all of Ontario.
Right.
And so a lot of people keep native species because.
Right. I mean, it's hard to make that comparison between Ontario and the Netherlands because, I mean, the Netherlands fits pretty much 3 times Lake Superior. It's such a small country, so enforcement is relatively easier. Also, I think a big difference is that because of the density that the closeness of how people live, they keep each other more accountable for what they're doing, and they have to consider these exotic animals because there are nuisance problems like smell or noise or whatever. So it's kind of, I would say, easier to enforce. I mean, here, if you drive 2 hours north, which makes sense. But the idea, and I think I support the Belgian government in that, is that you kind of have to trust your people. You have to trust your communities, and there will always be some underground trading and keeping of animals. But I don't think we should focus on that small percentage of people. We should focus on the general public that has a general understanding how people should be kept. And I think that will, cut off a huge chunk of illegal trade and all the issues that we've talked about today. Yeah?
Since the implementation of the Belgian list, has there been a mad rush of applications to add species
No.
to its state?
No, I think they had one and it was denied. Yeah, they were, Again, because people are it's a lot of work. So it's even that, right? You just discouraging people to go through that whole process just by setting the bar so high. Yeah. Thank you.